Women in war. The first shadow of women in war. The war has always been told in the voices of men, their boots striking the ground, their rifles echoing through the night, their medals clattering against their chests, their names etched into stone. History bent itself around their noise, yet in the spaces where sound dissolved, in the corners where voices cracked, in the silences heavier than drums, women carried the war in ways no chronicle wanted to remember. Their presence was not written in parades, but in scars that glowed faintly long after the fires dimmed. Women in war lived in the shadows, and yet those shadows were the ground on which everything stood. The first memory of women in war is not of uniforms, but of silence. They were mothers hiding their children from shells, wives carrying letters folded into rags, daughters pressing bread into the hands of men too broken to march further. Their battle was endurance, and endurance had no medal. When shells tore through homes, when villages dissolved into smoke, they remained. They stitched nights together with trembling fingers. They carried memory and voices that whispered after dark. They buried the nameless when no one else dared to dig. I remember one woman whose eyes told the entire war without speaking. She carried scars across her face, faint but unshakable, carved there by fire she did not start. The officers avoided her gaze, for it bent them in ways they could not endure. Her silence outlived their voices. Her scars weighed heavier than their medals. She was not remembered in books, but we who saw her knew. She was the ground itself. She held what men tried to erase. The officers built their power on fear, but women carried fear differently. They bore it in silence, in steady breath, in unbroken gazes. They walked among ruins with children pressed to their sides. They stitched wounds with trembling hands. They kept memory alive when men demanded forgetting. Their war was not fought with rifles, but with presence, and presence was heavier. At night, when the barracks turned restless, we felt them. Women in war were not always there in flesh, but they lingered in dreams. Men spoke their names in whispers, some in shame, some in longing, some in grief. Their shadows walked through our sleep, binding us to truths we tried to bury. They were reminders that war did not belong to officers or generals alone. It belonged to everyone it consumed, and women were always consumed first. The generals never spoke of them. Their speeches were carved from arrogance, polished with illusions of honor. Women did not fit into their medals. To remember them would be to admit weakness, to confess cruelty, to acknowledge shame. So they were erased, reduced to silence. Yet silence is not absence. Women carried silence until it bent authority itself. I dreamed once of a parade ground where men marched endlessly, rifles gleaming, voices chanting. Then women appeared, their faces scarred, their eyes unbroken. The rifles dissolved, the voices faltered, the medals fell into dust. Only the women remained, standing in silence that weighed heavier than drums. I woke trembling but certain. The war had never belonged to generals. It had always belonged to those who endured what could not be spoken. Women in war are not shadows. They are the law of memory. They carried names when officers erased them, bore scars when generals polished medals, stitched nights when soldiers collapsed. They endured not for glory, but because the world left them no choice, and endurance is stronger than command. The woman whose scars bent the generals, the woman whose silence broke the officers, the woman whose eyes carried forgotten names. She is not one, but all. She is every presence erased, every memory silenced, every truth buried. She is the thread binding wars together. Without her, there is no history, only illusion. And so the story begins not with battles, but with silence, not with medals, but with scars, not with victories, but with endurance. Women in war carried the weight no one wanted to name, and in their endurance, they outlived the very noise that tried to erase them, the weight of scars. Scars were the first language of women in war, scars. They were carved into skin, not as symbols of victory, but as remnants of survival. Fragments of fire and hunger and silence pressed into flesh. Men in uniforms displayed medals, gleaming discs of polished metal pinned above the heart. Women carried scars instead, lines of memory etched into the body, invisible to parades but visible to truth. The officers tried to look away from them, but scars are heavier than noise, heavier than medals, heavier than commands. The weight of scars is the weight of war itself. I remember one woman whose hands bore burns from carrying pots across shattered kitchens, feeding children when no food was left. Her palms were red and cracked, raw from years of smoke. When she placed those hands on the shoulders of soldiers, they froze. The officers avoided her touch, for it reminded them that hunger is heavier than discipline. Another woman bore scars across her back, whip marks not from enemies, but from officers who punished her silence. When she lifted her shirt to wash in the river, the marks glowed faintly in the light, and the men turned their eyes away. No one could pretend those scars were not the truth of the war. Scars carried names that were no longer spoken. A cut across the cheek could hold the memory of a village burned. A line across the arms, the memory of children lost. A burn across the chest, the memory of a husband shot. Scars were not just wounds, they were archives. They were the war etched permanently into flesh, so that forgetting became impossible. And women carried them without ceremony, without medal, without parade. They carried them because the war had left them no other choice. The officers could not withstand them. Their medals rattled when they faced scars. Their voices faltered when they shouted at women who bore them. They tried to erase them with silence, tried to bury them beneath orders. But scars cannot be erased. They remain as law written into skin. And when women lifted their eyes, unbowed despite the scars, the officers trembled. For medals lose their shine, but scars never lose their weight. The generals avoided the sight altogether. They who paraded with polished brass could not stand against flesh marked by truth. To them, scars were weakness, reminders that their glory was built on cruelty. They stayed absent, hiding behind speeches and papers, refusing to face what scars revealed. But absence is also confession. Their silence proved that scars carried what medals never could. The men who slept in the barracks began to understand it slowly. At first, they feared the scars, for they forced memory into the open. But over time, they began to see them as strength. They whispered of women who bore marks across their bodies, yet moved with steady grace, who carried children on scarred shoulders, who walked unflinching into ruins. They began to realize that survival was not weakness, but defiance, that scars were not shame, but testimony. I dreamed one night of a hall filled with officers and generals, their medals gleaming, their voices echoing. Then women entered, their bodies scarred, their eyes steady. The shine of medals dulled instantly. Voices cracked, the hall filled with silence heavier than parades. The scars glowed faintly, binding the air into witness. I woke trembling, but with clarity. War belongs not to medals, but to scars. Scars became the law of memory. They silenced lies. They bent authority. They carried what could not be buried. In them lived every hunger, every cry, every shame, every ghost. And though they bent women under their weight, they also made them unbreakable, because the war had carved into them everything it wanted to erase, and yet they endured. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers bore scars that could not be hidden. They ran across her arms, her face, her shoulders, glowing faintly in the light of dawn. She did not cover them. She did not bow her head. She carried them openly, and in doing so, she stripped the officers of their illusions. They could polish medals forever, but her scars would always weigh more. The men learned from her without words. They began to carry their own wounds differently. They no longer hid their burns, no longer buried their marks in shame. They recognized that scars are not only survival, but remembrance. To carry a scar is to refuse erasure. To endure is to speak without sound. The war consumed everything, but it could not consume scars. They remain etched into flesh long after battles end, long after medals rust, long after parades dissolve. They are the handwriting of history written on bodies the world tried to silence. And women bore more of them than anyone else. The weight of scars is the weight of truth. Women in war carried that truth across generations, across silence, across forgetting. They were never honored for it, but they never needed honor. They needed only endurance, and endurance became the greatest defiance. From that day forward, I no longer feared the sight of scars. I bent before them as I once bent before commands, but the bending was not of fear. It was of recognition. Scars weighed more than authority, and in that weight lived the only history worth remembering. The silence that survived the battles. Battles were thunder. They erupted in smoke and fire, the clash of rifles and artillery, the roar of commands shouted over chaos. For men, the war was always measured in sound, in the weight of boots striking earth, in the violent percussion of machines. Yet when the smoke drifted, when the shouting collapsed into echoes, when the dead were gathered into silence, it was women who remained. Their war was not measured in thunder, but in what came after, in silence that refused to vanish. And that silence survived the battles long after the noise had gone. The first silence was that of ruins. Villages stood in ashes, their streets hollow, their walls torn apart. Men passed through quickly, marching onto the next line, but women stayed among the ruins. They bent to pick through shattered homes, to gather photographs half-burned, to dig graves with trembling hands. They spoke little, for words could not rebuild. Their silence pressed deeper than grief, heavier than stone. It was not weakness, but endurance, a way of bearing what could not be named. The second silence was of absence. Husbands lost, sons conscripted, fathers vanished into mud, brothers swallowed by prisons. Women stood in doorways that no longer opened, cooked meals for mouths that never returned, carried names in their throats that the world had erased. They did not cry loudly. They carried absence in silence that filled rooms like shadow, and that silence bent even officers who dared not meet their eyes. For absence is heavier than death, and women bore it without bowing. The third silence was of shame. Too many carried wounds inflicted not by enemies, but by men who wore the same uniforms. Officers who believed their authority included women's bodies, generals who buried crimes beneath medals. Women bore those wounds quietly, not because they were weak, but because the world offered no space for their cries. Their silence was heavier than testimony. It condemned more than words ever could, and when they lifted their eyes, scars faintly glowing, the weight of that silence stripped authority of its power. The officers could not bear it. They shouted louder in the presence of silence, as though noise could erase it. But their voices cracked, their medals rattled, their hands trembled. They feared the silence more than rebellion. For rebellion they could crush, silence they could not. The generals stayed away, hiding in parades, for they knew silence would outlive their speeches, and it did. The men in the barracks began to learn differently. They who had once laughed too loud, shouted too much, filled the air with noise to forget, began to find steadiness in silence. When women passed with unflinching eyes, they grew quiet. When scars glowed faintly in firelight, they breathed slower. They began to realize that silence is not absence, but presence. It holds names, memory, endurance. It carries more weight than all the sound of battle. It happened again with others. Generals avoided her not out of respect, but out of fear. Their power was built on absence, on illusion, on forgetting. To face her gaze was to be reminded of everything they had erased. They did not dare. They remained absent, their absence louder than their speeches. They hid behind ceremonies, but ceremonies dissolve when silence is heavier. Her eyes revealed that weight. The men began to feel it too. They who had once tried to bury memory in noise, who had laughed too loud or shouted too much, began to grow quieter in her presence. Her eyes pressed forgotten names back into them. They dreamed of faces long gone, whispered names they had not spoken in years, wept silently into the night. It was painful, but it was also a kind of release. For forgetting devours the soul. Memory, though heavy, steadies it. I dreamed one night of a hall filled with generals. Their medals gleamed, their speeches echoed, their boots struck the marble floor. They spoke endlessly of victories, of glory, of power. Then women entered, their eyes glowing faintly, their scars unhidden. The speeches cracked mid-word, the medals dulled instantly, the boots faltered. Memory filled the hall like smoke, bending even the air. The generals trembled, their voices collapsed. The women stood steady, their silence heavier than all the noise. I woke trembling but certain, memory had already won. The officers tried to imitate their leaders, burying their shame in shouting, in punishing, in rattling medals, as if noise could erase scars. But it did not. Her eyes stripped away their illusions as easily as smoke dissipates in wind. They could not forget because she refused to allow it. Every scar glowed like testimony, every silence pressed like judgment. Her gaze was memory itself, heavier than command. The generals who vanished into absence left behind no legacy but illusion. Their names faded from stone, their medals rusted, their speeches dissolved. But the women they tried to erase remained. Their scars remained, their silence remained. Their eyes carried what history tried to bury. Women remembered, and in remembering they unmade forgetting. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers remembered not for herself alone, but for all. She carried names of the lost, faces of the dead, villages turned to ash, wounds unspoken. She bore memory in silence until it bent authority itself. And in that bearing she proved that history does not belong to generals. It belongs to those who endure. From that day forward, I no longer believed in the permanence of speeches or parades. They vanish quickly, like smoke scattered by wind. What remains are the eyes of those who refuse to forget, and in those eyes the war is remembered not as noise, but as truth. Women in war carried that truth. And because of them, memory will outlive forgetting. The shadows women walked through. War was always spoken of in light and thunder, in victories announced with banners, in defeats marked by smoke and flame. But beneath those flames, behind those banners, beneath the weight of boots and rifles, there were shadows, shadows of the forgotten, shadows of the wounded, shadows of the erased. And it was women who walked among them. They stepped where no parades marched, where no medals gleamed, where the silence was too heavy for men to endure. Women walked through shadows that belonged to no one else, and by walking there, they carried truths no general dared to speak. The first shadows were of hunger. Villages stripped bare, fields burned, kitchens empty. Men marched past quickly, carrying rations stolen from elsewhere, filling themselves enough to continue forward. Women remained in the ruins, searching for roots beneath frozen earth, boiling weeds in cracked pots, pressing crumbs into children's hands. Their steps through those shadows were silent, but silence carried more weight than any shout of command. Hunger was not glory, but survival, and survival lived in women's shadows. The second shadows were of shame. Too many bore wounds, inflicted not by enemy shells, but by men who wore familiar uniforms, officers who believed their rank gave them rights over bodies, generals who buried crimes beneath medals, soldiers who chose silence over defense. Women bore those wounds without audience, carrying them in silence heavier than chains. They walked through that shadow each day, unflinching, refusing to vanish. Their endurance was itself defiance, for shame could not erase them if they kept walking. The third shadows were of ghosts, men who never returned, names erased from rosters, faces buried in mud. Their absence filled the air like fog, pressing into lungs, bending shoulders. Women walked through those shadows with eyes that remembered, carrying names on lips that refused silence. They lit candles in ruined churches, stitched clothes for children who no longer had fathers, placed bread on empty plates. They bore the weight of ghosts until memory itself bent, but did not break. Officers could not endure those shadows. Their authority thrived in light, in noise, in the illusion of power. Shadows revealed their weakness, for in shadows medals dulled, voices cracked, boots stumbled. When women's eyes rose within those spaces, officers trembled. They saw more than scars. They saw the weight of everything they had erased pressing back into them. They fled quickly, their voices louder outside, as though noise could erase the silence that stripped them bare. Generals never entered the shadows. Their absence was louder than their parades. They remained in offices polished with illusion, in halls lined with flags, in ceremonies built from forgetting. They did not dare walk where women did, for shadows carried truths their medals could not withstand. Their silence was cowardice dressed as dignity, but women exposed it simply by enduring. For every scar that glowed faintly, every gaze lifted calmly, every silence pressed into the air, heavier than drums, was testimony they could not face. The men in the barracks began to see it differently. They who once feared shadows now found steadiness in them. They followed women's example without words, breathing slower, speaking less, allowing silence to bind them instead of destroy them. They began to recognize that shadows are not emptiness, but presence, that within them live scars, names, memory, endurance. Women taught them this, not with speeches but with steps, walking steadily where no officer dared to tread. I dreamed often of it, a battlefield filled with smoke, rifles clattering, voices breaking into thunder. Then the noise faded, ashes drifted, bodies stilled, fire collapsed into embers. Women entered, carrying silence heavier than the roar. They bent to gather the lost, to hold children, to stitch wounds. Officers shouted at them to leave, but their voices rang hollow. The silence outlived them. I woke trembling but certain. Noise belongs to war. Silence belongs to truth. The silence of women survived every battle. It outlived thunder, outlasted parades, pressed heavier than medals. It carried scars, shame, absence, memory. It endured not for glory, but because there was no choice. And endurance itself became defiance. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers carried silence like a shield no weapon could break. She stitched nights with it, filled rooms with it, bent commands beneath it. Her silence was not empty. It was everything the war wanted to erase, but could not. And in that refusal, it became eternal. From that day forward, I no longer feared silence. I feared noise, for noise was illusion. Silence was truth. Women in war taught me that, and it was their silence, heavier than battles, that would outlive the war itself. The eyes that remembered what the generals forgot. The generals lived on forgetting. They polished their medals until they gleamed bright enough to blind themselves. Wrote speeches full of victories where there had only been ashes, raised parades to cover the silence that followed battles. Forgetting was their survival, for memory would have broken them. They forgot names, they forgot villages, they forgot shame. They believed history would echo only their noise and never the truths they buried. But women in war remembered what they tried to erase. Their eyes carried memory steadier than paper, heavier than medals, more enduring than parades. I once saw a general enter the yard with arrogance carved into every step. His chest sagged under the weight of medals, his voice rang sharp, his boots struck like thunder. He commanded silence, demanded obedience, spoke names as though they belonged to him. Then she lifted her gaze. Her eyes were steady, scarred, unflinching. The general's words faltered, his throat tightened, his voice cracked. In her gaze lived the names he had erased, the villages he had destroyed, the shame he had buried. He forgot, but her eyes remembered, and memory silenced him. I dreamed of it often. A battlefield at dusk, smoke dissolving into grey, shadows stretching across broken earth. Men avoided them, stepping quickly into light, but women walked directly into the dimness, their figures steady, their eyes glowing faintly. The shadows bowed toward them, filled with ghosts that whispered names long forgotten. Officers shouted from a distance but dared not approach. Generals hid entirely. Only the women walked through shadows, unafraid, unbroken. I woke trembling but certain. Truth lives in the places men abandon. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers walked through shadows each day. Her silence pressed heavier there, her scars glowed brighter, her memory stretched wider. She carried presence where others carried absence, steadiness where others carried fear. She walked not for glory, but because endurance demanded it. And in walking, she remade the meaning of survival. Women in war walked through shadows to carry truths that history tried to bury. Their silence spoke where voices collapsed. Their scars remembered where medals forgot. Their endurance bound the world where fear tried to break it. And though the war consumed everything, it could not consume the steps of women who walked through what others fled. From then on, shadows no longer frightened me. They became places of witness. For in them lived scars, ghosts, silence, and the unbroken gaze of women who refused to vanish. The scars that spoke louder than medals. Medals were the language of generals and officers. They were small circles of polished metal pinned above the heart, supposed to shine brighter than shame, to outweigh silence, to rewrite cruelty into glory. Every parade displayed them, every ceremony exalted them, every report counted them. They clinked like currency, as if honor could be measured by weight of brass. But women carried no medals. They carried scars, and scars spoke louder than all the polished illusions men tried to fasten to their coats. I remember one day when an officer entered the yard with medals rattling proudly against his chest. His voice rang sharp, his commands cracked the air like whips. Men stiffened under the noise, bending as always, but a woman stood steady. Her coat slipped from her shoulders, revealing scars carved into her skin by fire and silence. The officer faltered mid-command. His voice cracked. His medals seemed suddenly fragile, like tin toys clattering uselessly. He turned quickly, muttering, unable to face the weight of scars that stripped him bare. It was always like this. Medals were noise, but scars were truth. Medals could shine for a moment, but scars glowed forever. Medals needed parades, but scars endured even in silence. The officers tried to bury them, to avert their eyes, to erase them with shouts, but scars cannot be erased. They are history etched into flesh, and women bore them openly, refusing to bow. The generals knew it too. They avoided the sight entirely. They remained in offices, in ceremonies, behind walls where polished brass gleamed under artificial light. They could not endure the sight of scars because scars were proof of their crimes. They claimed victories in speeches, but women's scars revealed the cost. They claimed honor in medals, but scars reminded them of shame. Their absence was confession. They dared not stand where scars stripped away their illusions. The men in the barracks began to see differently. At first they flinched when scars appeared, for they forced memory to return. But over time, they grew steadier, recognizing that scars were not weakness but endurance. They began to respect them more than medals. They whispered of women who bore wounds across their backs, yet stood unflinching, who carried burns across their hands, yet stitched tirelessly, who endured without needing shine or ceremony. They realized that scars outlived parades, that scars remembered what history erased. At night, I dreamed of two halls. In one hall, officers paraded, their medals gleaming, their voices echoing endlessly. But the light dimmed, and their medals dulled, their voices cracked, their boots stumbled. In the other hall, women stood silent, their scars glowing faintly like embers. The silence there was heavy, steady, unbroken. It silenced the noise of the first hall completely. I woke trembling but certain. Scars speak louder than medals. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers bore scars that glowed faintly in dawn's light. They bent authority more than commands ever could. Officers trembled before them, generals fled from them, men steadied in their presence. Her scars carried more weight than brass, more truth than speeches, more endurance than fear. She did not wear them for glory, but because the war had carved them into her. They became her testimony, heavier than illusions. Scars do not ask for honor, they demand recognition. They are the handwriting of survival, the proof that cruelty was endured, the witness to silence that could not be erased. Women carried them not to boast, but because they had no choice. And in carrying them, they unmade the language of medals. From that day forward, I no longer admired the shine of brass. It looked hollow, fragile, false. I admired instead the faint glow of scars. The lines carved into flesh that refused to bow, the silent testimony carried without parade. Women in war taught me that medals vanish, but scars endure, and in their endurance, they speak forever. The silence women carried into the barracks. The barracks had always been ruled by noise. Boots hammered against the stone at dawn. Whistles shrieked until ears rang. Commands cut the air sharper than blades, and laughter too loud tried to bury fear. It was a place of echoes, where silence was considered weakness and noise was mistaken for strength. Men learned to shout to cover trembling, to bark to disguise emptiness, to laugh when their hearts were breaking. The officers depended on it, for noise was their weapon, their armor, their illusion of control. But when women entered, they carried silence heavier than all the shouting, and slowly the barracks bent to it. That silence was not emptiness. It carried scars, absence, names, shame, and endurance. It pressed into the air thicker than smoke. When a woman stitched in the corner, the thread sliding softly through fabric, men felt it more strongly than they felt the bark of orders. They breathed slower, their hands steadied, their voices faltered into whispers. Officers shouted harder in those moments, desperate to reclaim the air, but their voices cracked against silence that would not move. I remember one evening when an officer patrolled the room, boots striking the floor, voice cutting through the dimness. He demanded posture, he demanded speed, he demanded obedience, but her eyes lifted calmly, her scars faintly glowing in lamplight. She said nothing, but silence pressed outward. The officer's voice collapsed mid-command. His steps faltered, his medals rattled. He turned away quickly, muttering into the dark. The men saw it. The barracks no longer belonged to his voice. It belonged to her silence. At night, the silence grew even heavier. Dreams pressed against us. Ghosts lingered. Absence filled every bunk. Men tossed and whispered, their fear echoing louder than shells. But then her stitching began, soft and steady. Her silence wrapped around the room like a blanket. The restless breaths slowed, the sobs softened, the whispers dissolved. Officers who entered to disrupt found themselves trembling, unable to pierce the weight of silence. They left quickly, boots uncertain. The barracks belonged to her then, steadier than commands, heavier than parades. Generals never dared to enter. Their authority depended on ceremonies, on speeches, on medals gleaming in daylight. At night, their power dissolved, and silence revealed them for what they were. If they had stood before her, their words would have cracked, their medals would have dulled, their arrogance would have collapsed. They chose absence instead, but absence was confession. They knew silence carried more weight than their entire chain of command. The men in their bunks began to lean on it. They waited for her eyes to rise, for her stitching to start, for her silence to press into the room. They found steadiness in it, strength in it, endurance in it. They realized that silence is not void but presence, not weakness but law, not emptiness but truth. The war had tried to strip everything away, but silence carried what could not be erased. And women bore it into the barracks until it bent even the walls. I dreamed of it often. In the dream, the barracks was filled with noise, officers shouting, men laughing too loudly, boots striking endlessly. Then she lifted her gaze. Silence fell like a tide. The noise cracked, boots stumbled, laughter collapsed into sobs. The officers fled, unable to withstand it. Only silence remained, heavy and unbroken, carried in her eyes, bound in her scars. I woke trembling but certain. The war belonged not to noise but to silence. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers carried silence into the barracks until it unmade every illusion. She bore it without trembling, filled it with memory, pressed it into authority until it collapsed. She reminded us that silence is not weakness, it is truth, and truth weighs more than any command shouted in the dark. From that day forward, the barracks was no longer ruled by noise, it was ruled by silence, and women carried that silence as their final defiance. The names women refused to let die. The war devoured names as quickly as it devoured lives. A man fell in the morning, and by evening his name was already gone, replaced by a number in a report or silence in roll call. Entire villages burned and their names dissolved into smoke. Families were scattered and their names disappeared into the wind. The generals knew this well. They depended on forgetting. For every erased name made their medals shine brighter, every silence made their parades louder. But women refused to let names die. Their lips carried memory, their eyes bore testimony, their silence held names heavier than stone. I once saw a woman kneel by a ditch where bodies had been buried without words. Officers stood nearby, impatient, eager to move forward, eager to cover the ground with reports instead of graves. But she traced the air above the soil with her fingers, whispering names softly. She spoke not only for the dead, but for the absent, the vanished, the erased. The officers turned their faces away, unable to bear the sound of memory pressing back into silence. But her voice was not loud, it was steady, and in its steadiness, names lived again. In the barracks, it was the same. At night, when men lay restless, dreams heavy with loss, women whispered names into the silence. They did not raise their voices, for they knew the power of softness. They let names linger in the air until the room grew steady. Men wept quietly into their blankets, not out of despair, but out of release. For hearing names again meant remembering they had lived, that they had mattered, that they had not vanished into the machinery of war. Officers tried to silence it. They barked louder at dawn, shouted harder during drills, punished men who whispered too much. But their voices cracked each time a woman's eyes lifted calmly. For in those eyes lived every name they had tried to erase. They carried the faces of men erased from rosters, of villages burned from maps, of children swallowed by hunger. Her gaze pressed against them until their voices trembled. No command could erase the testimony of silence. Generals avoided it completely. They who had signed papers that erased thousands could not endure the sight of names remembered in whispers. Their medals rattled weakly when memory pressed too close. Their speeches faltered when silence bent heavier. They stayed in offices, drafting illusions, hiding behind ceremonies. Their absence was their confession. They knew they had forgotten what women refused to let die. The men changed in time. They who had once surrendered to forgetting began to remember again. They whispered names before sleep, carved initials into wood, carried tokens in their pockets. They followed the example of women who remembered without permission, who bore names heavier than medals, who carried ghosts as though they were still alive. It bent them, but it also steadied them. For forgetting devours, but memory binds. I dreamed one night of a hall filled with officers reading lists aloud. Their voices were sharp, their pens quick, their faces hard. One by one they erased names, crossing them out as though they had never existed. But then women entered, their eyes glowing faintly, their lips steady. They spoke the names again, one by one, pressing them back into the air. The lists burned in the officers' hands, their voices cracked into silence, their medals fell into dust. The names filled the hall until it trembled with memory. I woke shaking but certain. Names are stronger than commands. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers carried names in silence as if they were carved into her scars. She bore them without flinching, pressed them into officers who could not look at her, carried them into nights where men trembled, spoke them without sound until they lived again. Her endurance was testimony, her silence was remembrance. Women in war refused to let names die. They carried them in whispers, in eyes, in scars, in silence. They bore the memory that authority tried to erase. And because of them, history itself bent differently. For medals tarnish, speeches dissolve, parades vanish, but names endure when someone refuses to bury them. From that day forward, I no longer feared memory. I feared forgetting, for forgetting is death. Remembering, even when it bends the soul, is life. And women carried life through the war simply by refusing to let names die. The shadows of mothers, sisters, and daughters. The war was always described as a field of soldiers and officers, a contest of strategy and fire, a theater of commands and victories. But beyond those lines, hidden in the silence the generals refused to write about, lived the shadows of mothers, sisters, and daughters. They were not counted in reports. They were not named in medals. They were not spoken in ceremonies. Yet without them, the war could not have endured a single day. Their shadows stretched behind every march, lingered beside every barrack, pressed into every silence. Women bore the war not with rifles, but with presence, and their presence outlived even the thunder of guns. Mothers carried hunger in their bodies so children could eat. They waited at gates that never opened, their eyes steady, their silence heavier than commands. They buried sons in unmarked graves and stitched memory into every scar of their homes. Their shadows lived in kitchens that no longer had bread, in doorways left empty, in prayers whispered into ruins. Soldiers marched forward, but the ground beneath them was carried by mothers' endurance. Sisters bore absence like chains. They grew old before their time, working fields stripped bare, carrying letters that never arrived, speaking names that dissolved into silence. They sat in corners of barracks, sewing uniforms with hands cracked by frost, waiting for voices that never returned. Their shadows fell across every empty chair, across every broken path. Officers avoided their eyes, for in them lay the truth of loss no medal could erase. Daughters carried memory into futures broken before they began. They walked barefoot through ruins, their eyes too old for their years, their silence heavier than speeches. They carried buckets of water across fields scattered with bones. They pressed crumbs into the mouths of younger children. They sang songs without melody to keep shadows away at night. Their steps wrote testimony across the ground, testimony the generals tried to erase with reports, but daughters endured. Their shadows walked beside us long after battles ended, reminding us that innocence once existed and had been consumed. The officers could not bear the weight of these shadows. They barked commands louder when women were near, their voices desperate to fill the silence that bent them. They rattled medals to cover trembling hands, shouted until their throats cracked, punished men who whispered too much about women's endurance. But shadows do not bend to noise. They pressed heavier with every attempt to erase them, and officers fled from their own weakness. Generals avoided them completely. They knew their power was illusion, built on forgetting. Mothers remembered, sisters endured, daughters carried memory forward. To face them would have been to admit their failure, to confess that their parades meant nothing beside women's silence. They polished medals instead, raised banners, gave speeches. But absence is also a voice, and their absence confessed what they could not say. It began in small moments. An officer screamed at a woman bent over, stitching in the corner of the barracks. His voice echoed against the walls, but she did not flinch. Her hands moved steadily, her gaze calm, her silence unbroken. His face flushed red, his throat cracked, his boots stamped harder. Yet every attempt to force reaction collapsed. He turned away, trembling, his command undone by her refusal to answer with fear. His noise collapsed against silence like waves against stone. Another time in the yard, an officer demanded that she salute his medals. His voice cracked with anger, his hand gripped his belt tightly. She stood steady, her scars glowing faintly, her gaze steady. She did not salute, she did not bow, she did not move. The officer's voice faltered, his hand trembled, his medals rattled weakly. He shouted again, but the air swallowed his noise. The silence pressed heavier. Men in line saw it clearly. Authority had shifted. The officers grew desperate. They shouted louder, punished harsher, barked longer. But their voices cracked more each time. Their eyes darted when women entered. Their hands trembled when silence pressed. The barracks no longer obeyed their noise. It obeyed the rhythm of silence carried by scars and unflinching gazes. The officers began to avoid women altogether, passing quickly, muttering commands softer as though ashamed of their own weakness. Generals noticed the collapse but did not intervene. They knew silence would bend them too. They had built their power on ceremonies, on noise amplified by parades, on medals gleaming beneath speeches. But silence is heavier than ceremony. Silence is truth. And they dared not face it. Their absence grew louder than their words. They hid behind walls, drafting orders, pretending authority remained intact. But their silence was not endurance, it was fear. The men changed slowly, watching officers tremble where once they had towered. They whispered at night of how silence broke authority, how scars bent medals, how a steady gaze unmade commands. They began to breathe differently, no longer drowning in noise, but learning to endure with quiet strength. They began to see that survival did not belong to those who shouted loudest, but to those who carried silence without bowing. I dreamed one night of a hall filled with officers. They shouted endlessly, their voices layered, their commands overlapping, their medals rattling like chains. The noise was unbearable, pressing into ears, burning through lungs. Then women entered calm and scarred, their eyes glowing faintly. Silence fell instantly, heavy and absolute. The officers' voices cracked one by one, medals fell from their coats, boots stumbled. The hall collapsed into quiet, broken by truth heavier than sound. I woke trembling but certain. Noise cannot survive where silence holds witness. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers carried silence like a weapon no man could wield. She pressed it into barracks, into yards, into halls of command. She bore it without trembling, stripped authority bare with it, broke noise into fragments with it. She showed us that silence is not absence. It is truth unbroken, memory unburied, scars made eternal. And truth cannot be shouted away. Women in war carried silence not because they wanted to, but because the world gave them no choice. Yet in carrying it, they remade the war itself. They bent officers who lived on noise. They silenced generals who built on illusion. They steadied men who bent under fear. Their silence did what no rifle could. It broke authority into dust. From that day forward, I no longer feared shouts. They were hollow, brittle, fragile. I feared silence, for silence was unbreakable. And it was women in war who taught me that the quietest presence can weigh more than every voice raised against it. The generals who hid from women's eyes. Generals carried themselves as if they were carved from stone. They marched not in yards but in parades, their boots polished, their coats heavy with medals that clinked like coins in the pockets of kings. They spoke in speeches rather than in words, their voices sharpened into weapons meant to pierce the silence of the defeated. They built their authority on distance, their power on illusion, their glory on forgetting. Yet even men who believed themselves invincible could not endure the eyes of women. And so the generals hid. They did not hide from rifles or from shells. They commanded comfortably from behind their maps, far from mud and hunger. But when a woman's gaze rose to meet theirs, scars glowing faintly in the pale light, silence pressing heavier than parades, they trembled. Their words faltered, their medals dulled, their voices cracked in ways that cannons never made them crack. For her eyes carried truth they had spent their lives burying, and no illusion survives when truth is seen. I remember one rare day when a general entered the yard. His presence weighed like thunder. The officers stiffened, the men bent, the ground itself seemed to tremble. He shouted names as though they belonged to him, demanded salutes as though reverence was owed. But then she stepped forward, her gaze lifted calm and steady. The air shifted instantly. The general's voice faltered, his throat caught, his medals rattled weakly. He turned away after only a few words, his command unfinished, his presence undone. Men who had once shaken before him now saw his trembling. He had not been broken by armies. He had been broken by eyes that carried silence heavier than his noise. It happened often enough that they stopped coming altogether. Generals remained in their offices, hidden behind thick doors, buried in paperwork and speeches. They polished their medals in private, their reflections cracked by trembling hands. They dared not stand where women did, for their absence was safer than facing truth. They knew they could survive battles and yet be undone by a scar, by a silence, by a gaze unbroken. And so they hid, their cowardice louder than their parades. Officers followed their example, though they pretended otherwise. They shouted harder, punished sharper, barked orders until their throats were raw. But men saw the cracks. They saw the trembling hands, the darting eyes, the flushed faces. They saw authority collapsing not beneath rebellion, but beneath silence. The generals had taught them that avoidance was survival, and so they too began to avert their gaze. But women remained. Women endured. Their silence bent everything. The men in the barracks began to whisper of it. They spoke not of victories or campaigns, but of generals who could not meet women's eyes. They whispered of power undone by scars, of medals stripped of meaning, of voices silenced without a word. They spoke of truth heavier than parades, of silence steadier than authority. Their whispers spread wider than speeches, filling the air until absence itself became witness. I dreamed one night of a hall filled with generals. Their coats were heavy with medals, their voices rose in perfect unison, their boots struck marble in rhythm. They spoke endlessly of victories, of nations, of power. Then women entered. Their scars glowed faintly, their eyes unflinching, their silence absolute. One by one the voices cracked. One by one medals fell to the ground, rattling like bones. The hall collapsed into silence heavier than stone. The generals vanished into absence, leaving only women's eyes glowing in the dark. I woke, trembling but certain. Authority cannot survive the truth of endurance. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers disarmed generals more completely. They hid not from weapons, but from memory. Not from battle, but from scars. Not from armies, but from silence. She bore in her gaze everything they had erased, every village burned, every name forgotten, every shame buried. They could not endure it. They chose absence instead. But absence speaks too, and it spoke of fear greater than any cannon. Women in war carried eyes that remembered, that endured, that bore scars without bowing. Generals carried medals that polished forgetting. When the two met, medals dissolved, voices cracked, authority vanished. And so the generals hid. But hiding did not save them. It only proved that truth is heavier than illusion. From that day forward, I no longer believed in the permanence of generals. Their absence was louder than their presence. Their speeches were thinner than silence. Their medals weaker than scars. The only command that endured was the gaze of women who refused to bow. The children who carried women's silence. The war consumed children as quickly as it consumed villages, armies, and nations. They were born into hunger, raised in ruins, taught to fear shadows before they could spell their own names. Their voices were quiet, not by choice, but because noise belonged to officers, to rifles, to parades that had no place for them. And yet, children carried something the war could not erase. They carried the silence of women, the unspoken strength pressed into them through eyes that endured, scars that testified, and hands that guided even when empty. Mothers pressed silence into their children when shells fell from the sky. A hand across the mouth, a whisper without sound, a steady gaze that said, "Stay alive." Sisters taught silence when officers prowled the yards, telling younger ones with only a glance when to hide, when to wait, when to breathe softly. Daughters learned silence from watching women stitch through the night, scars glowing faintly under dim light, faces unbowed even as hunger carved deeper lines into them. That silence became a language. It was not emptiness but survival, not absence but endurance. The officers never noticed children at first. They stepped past them in parades, ignored them at the edges of yards, pretended they were invisible. But invisibility carries its own weight. When a child stared with eyes too old for his years, the officer's voice cracked. When a daughter carried a bucket past the gates, scars of her mother's silence etched into her small face, the officer's hand trembled. For children revealed that the war was not just fought between soldiers, it devoured the innocent, and innocence returned as silence heavier than medals. Generals feared them even more. They gave speeches about future generations, about sacrifice, about glory, but they never faced the children who bore their cruelty. They polished medals while daughters scavenged in ruins, wrote reports while sons buried fathers, held parades while children pressed crumbs into the mouths of younger siblings. They hid behind illusion, for to look into a child as eyes was to confess that their victory was built on ash, and children carried silence louder than any confession. I remember one day when a group of children entered the barracks with their mothers, carrying baskets of scraps. Their steps were light, but their eyes were heavy. They looked at officers with the same unflinching steadiness women carried. No words were spoken, but the air bent. Officers shifted nervously, their voices faltering as they barked orders. Men in their bunks froze, realizing that authority collapsed even before those too young to speak it aloud. For silence carried through generations, binding itself into children's very breath. At night, the presence of children pressed heavier. Men who had forgotten how to pray found themselves whispering names into the dark. Not for themselves, but for the young who should not have known such hunger. Women stitched quietly, and the children watched, their eyes wide, their silence binding the barracks tighter than any command. Officers entered but could not endure it. They left quickly, muttering into the shadows. The barracks belonged not to their noise, but to silence, carried by women and passed into children. I dreamed one night of a ruined field where children stood in lines, no rifles in their hands, no medals on their chests, no uniforms covering their bones, only eyes, wide and unflinching, glowing faintly with the silence of their mothers. Generals shouted from a distance, but their voices dissolved. Officers rattled their medals, but they fell like dust. The children stood unbroken, their silence pressing outward until even the ground trembled. I woke trembling too, but certain. The future did not belong to parades. It belonged to silence carried forward. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers gave that silence to children without speaking. They saw her scars and understood truth before they understood language. They felt her presence and learned endurance before they learned to walk. They carried her silence into every ruin, every hunger, every absence. And because they carried it, the war could not erase them. Women in war gave children no choice but survival became defiance. Their silence passed from mother to daughter, from sister to brother, from scar to gaze, until it weighed heavier than medals, louder than speeches, more eternal than commands. The officers trembled before it, the generals hid from it, the men leaned on it, and the children carried it forward, ensuring that memory would outlive forgetting. From that day forward, I no longer saw children as fragile. I saw them as bearers of the heaviest inheritance, carrying silence pressed into them by women who refused to bow. And I knew then that the war, though it consumed everything, could never consume silence passed into children's eyes. The songs women never sang. War was always measured in noise, in the beating of drums, in the clash of boots, in the metallic chorus of rifles and medals. Men sang songs to keep fear away, chants to keep rhythm, hymns to disguise the hollowness that echoed inside them. Songs were armor, voices sharpened into shields, but women in war carried songs they never sang. Melodies lived in their throats, but silence bound them heavier than music. Their songs were unspoken, their hymns unsung, their voices buried beneath endurance. And those silent songs weighed more than any anthem shouted in parades. The first unsung songs were of mourning. Women stood at ditches filled with nameless bodies, their lips moving but no sound rising. They carried grief into silence because the world would not allow their cries. Their throats ached with melodies of loss, but they swallowed them. Instead, their silence pressed heavier, binding memory into the air. Men marched past, officers shouted over it, generals built speeches to drown it. But the silence of songs unsung bent everything. The second unsung songs were of love. Women wrote words onto scraps of paper, letters that trembled with affection, lullabies pressed into sentences, tenderness carved into fragments. Yet their voices never sang them aloud. They hummed softly in their hearts, carrying hope through hunger, endurance through ruin. Their silence became testimony that love endured even when language was denied. And in that unsung music, memory lived. The third unsung songs were of defiance. They wanted to sing against officers who stripped dignity, against generals who buried shame, against soldiers who forgot humanity. But their defiance was carried in silence, heavier than shouting, more absolute than anthem. Their refusal to give melody to cruelty became the law of endurance. Officers trembled before their unbroken eyes, generals hid from their scars, and men followed their silence more than any shouted command. The officers grew uneasy when women gathered. They feared the silence between them, the way their eyes met as though songs were passing invisibly from one to another. They barked louder to cover it, punished men who dared to hum, filled the air with orders until their voices cracked. But silence cannot be drowned. It carries deeper than noise, heavier than drums. And the songs women never sang pressed against them until their medals dulled. Generals feared it even more. They built their authority on anthems sung in parades, on hymns shouted by crowds, on the illusion that noise was loyalty. But women's silence revealed the truth. Every unsung song was defiance. Every buried melody was testimony. Every quiet breath was endurance. They dared not face it. They paraded louder, shouted stronger, polished medals brighter. But all of it dissolved against silence. The songs women never sang outlasted them. The men in the barracks learned slowly. At night, when ghosts pressed close, they listened for songs, but heard only silence, and in time they understood. That silence was not emptiness. It was full of melodies swallowed, hymns buried, voices denied. They began to whisper softer, to hum without sound, to follow the rhythm of silence rather than noise. They found steadiness in the absence of music, recognizing it as testimony too heavy to ignore. I dreamed of it often. A field where men marched, their voices loud, their songs echoing. But the sound collapsed into ash. Women stood in the ruins, their lips unmoving, their eyes steady, their scars glowing faintly. Around them, silence pressed heavy, but within it lived songs unsung. The air itself trembled with melodies no one could hear, but everyone felt. The generals shouted from a distance, but their voices broke. Officers rattled their medals, but they dulled. Only the silence of unsung songs endured. I woke trembling, but certain. Some music is stronger when it is never voiced. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers carried songs she never sang. They lived in her silence, bound into her scars, pressed into her gaze. She bore them without sound, but with presence heavier than symphonies. Her silence was melody, her endurance was hymn, her scars were chorus. She carried what no anthem could contain. Women in war sang by refusing to sing. Their silence was stronger than anthems, their endurance louder than drums, their testimony deeper than hymns. The songs they never sang outlived the voices of generals, outlasted the parades of officers, and pressed into memory heavier than history itself. From that day forward, I no longer listened for music in war. I listened for silence. For in silence, I heard the unsung songs of women, and they were more eternal than any anthem men ever shouted. The fire women carried in their silence. The war devoured fire and turned it into ruin. Villages burned until only ashes remained. Houses collapsed into embers. Fields glowed red before becoming blackened scars across the earth. Fire was meant to destroy, to erase, to bury memory in smoke. But there was another fire, a hidden one, a fire carried not in torches or in shells, but in silence. Women bore it inside themselves, a flame invisible yet unextinguished. The fire they carried did not burn homes or fields. It burned illusions, lies, and the authority of men who tried to erase them. Their silence was fire, steady and unyielding, and it endured where destruction had consumed everything else. This fire showed itself in eyes that did not bow. When officers barked orders and women remained still, their gaze unbroken, the fire glowed brighter. It was not rebellion spoken aloud, but a quiet flame that scorched arrogance. Officers turned red with frustration, their voices cracking, their hands trembling, because they felt the heat of something they could not control. The medals on their chests seemed smaller in its light, as if brass could melt before truth carried silently in a scar. It showed itself in scars themselves. Every mark carved into women's bodies became fuel. Every wound turned into ember. They bore them not as shame, but as testimony. The fire glowed through them, reminding men that cruelty could not erase endurance. Generals avoided those scars, like men afraid of heat they could not withstand. They knew medals could be polished, speeches rehearsed, ceremonies staged. But scars glowed with fire that could not be dimmed. It showed itself in the way women endured hunger. They pressed crumbs into children's hands, carried water across ruined fields, bent their backs under burdens that bent men to breaking. Their silence in those moments was not emptiness, it was flame. It consumed despair and turned it into endurance, burned fear and turned it into steadiness, seared forgetting and turned it into memory. Officers could not look at them long, for the fire revealed their weakness. Generals hid, for the fire revealed their shame. But the fire did not hide. It glowed in silence every day. The men in the barracks felt it too. They who once drowned in noise began to lean into warmth they could not explain. In the darkest nights when dreams devoured sleep, they looked to women stitching in silence. They saw the glow in their eyes, faint but steady, and it steadied them. The fire carried through silence became the only warmth in a world of ashes. It kept them alive when noise could not. I dreamed one night of a battlefield covered in embers. Smoke rose, fire consumed everything. Men shouted until their voices cracked. Then women appeared, calm, scarred, their silence glowing like hidden flame. The battlefield hushed. The fire they carried was not destruction, but endurance. It spread quietly, filling the air with light the smoke could not smother. Officers fled from it, generals vanished into absence. Only women remained. their silence burning brighter than ruins. I woke trembling but certain. Fire does not only destroy, it also remembers. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers carried this fire more than any. In her gaze it glowed steady, in her scars it smoldered, in her silence it burned without sound. She did not wield it as weapon, but bore it as presence. Wherever she stood, arrogance withered, lies dissolved, medals dulled. She reminded us that true fire does not consume fields but illusions. It destroys what should not survive and leaves what endures. Women in war carried fire in silence. It did not roar, it did not crackle, it did not blind. It glowed steady, unbroken, enduring. It burned authority into dust, seared forgetting into memory, and pressed heat into the hearts of those who had none left. This fire was their inheritance, their defiance, their testimony. And long after the war reduced the world to ashes, the fire carried in their silence continued to burn. From that day forward, I no longer feared flames. I feared the silence where no fire lived. For silence without fire is emptiness, but silence with fire is truth. And it was women in war who taught me that endurance itself burns, and its flame is eternal. The silence that outlived the war. When the guns finally stopped, when the smoke dissolved into pale skies, when the officers' voices cracked into whispers and the generals' medals lost their shine, the world expected relief. They believed silence would mean peace, that absence of thunder would mean healing, that the end of noise would mean the end of suffering. But the silence that came after the war was not peace. It was memory, it was scars, it was women, and their silence outlived the war. The officers tried to fill the void with ceremony. They polished their boots until they gleamed, rattled their medals as if brass could replace truth, shouted commands in yards now empty of soldiers, but their noise sounded hollow, like echoes without walls. For the silence carried by women pressed heavier than their words. They could not shout it away. They could not polish it out of existence. Their authority had ended, not with rifles, but with scars that remembered. The generals hid in offices, their speeches written carefully, their hands trembling as they drafted lines about victory. But they knew. Their medals dulled on their coats, their reflections blurred in polished surfaces. They avoided windows, for outside walked women who endured without bowing. They avoided fields, for in the soil lay names they had erased. They avoided eyes, for in them glowed silence heavier than history. They claimed to have ended the war, but the war had outlived them, carried in the endurance of women who refused to vanish. Mothers buried their dead, but not their memory. Sisters carried absence as if it were breath. Daughters inherited scars without needing to be wounded. Their silence pressed into ruins, into kitchens, into graves, into the very air. It reminded all who survived that peace is not absence of noise, but presence of truth. And truth weighed more than parades. Men in the barracks who once shouted too loudly now moved quietly. They whispered names instead of burying them. They carried scars instead of hiding them. They leaned into silence instead of fearing it. They learned that endurance does not roar, it steadies. And they had learned it from women whose silence was law. I dreamed one night of a world rebuilt. Villages rose from ash, fields sprouted green again, children ran barefoot in laughter. Officers tried to raise their voices, but the air did not bend to them. Generals tried to parade, but their medals crumbled into dust. And in the center of it all stood women, their scars glowing faintly, their silence unbroken. The world bent to them now, not with noise, but with recognition. Their silence filled the air until it became the foundation of peace. I woke trembling but certain. Wars do not end with treaties. They end when silence outlives them. The woman whose eyes disarmed the officers endured into that silence. Her gaze carried names still, her scars glowed with memory, her presence bore witness. She had broken authority not by fighting, but by refusing to bow. And now she stood as proof that survival is itself victory, her silence carried forward, unbroken, eternal. Women in war did not receive medals. They received scars. They did not march in parades. They walked in ruins. They did not shout commands. They carried silence. Yet it was their silence that outlived the war. Their scars that remembered truth, their endurance that bent history. The noise of officers faded, the absence of generals confessed itself, the illusion of medals dissolved. Only women remained, steady and unbowed, their silence heavier than time. From that day forward, I no longer believed in endings. Wars do not end when guns go quiet. They live in scars, in names, in memory, in silence. But women carry that silence into futures the war cannot reach. And in carrying it, they outlive the very thing that tried to erase them. The silence of women outlived the war. And in that silence lives the only truth worth remembering.